Hi there, and welcome to Peninsula Players Presents, where we are presenting the history of Peninsula Players Theater from 1935. And I've got someone here today with me who's been involved with Peninsula Players Theater since 1950, Jim Maronek. Jim, hi, how are you?
I'm fine. Hi.
Good. I want to tell you a little bit about Jim, who has been very involved with Peninsula Players for quite a long time. He has designed for theaters across the United States, including on and off Broadway, and his designs have been exhibited and he's won awards throughout the world, including Joseph Jefferson Awards for Best Scene Design and for Best Lighting Design, plus seven other nominations. And at last count, I believe, Jim, you've done over 300 productions. Is that correct?
Well, I stopped counting around 250, so I
Oh,
can't say for sure.
okay. You've done a few.
Yes.
Um, Jim was for many years resident designer for the Goodman Theater in Chicago and was also a professor of design at the School of the Art Institute. And he is a professor emeritus of the theater school at DePaul University. His gallery of fine art is at Silver Poplar Studios in Ellison Bay, up in Door County. And Jim has been on the Peninsula Players Theater Board since 1996. So, in our last interview with Audra Beckery Boyle, our business manager and historian, we covered the years 1950 to 1951. So, it's very appropriate that Jim is here today because he began in 1950. So, let's go back there and talk about that, Jim. But first, I'd like to ask, where are you
Okay.
from?
Where am I from? I'm from uh, Milwaukee,
Oh, you
born
are
and raised in Whitefish Bay.
Whitefish
Yes.
Bay. And how did you get
Yep.
started in theater and scene design?
I was in junior high school when the bug bit me. I
Uh huh.
used to listen to the Opera Theater of the Air and try and design the scenery for what I was hearing on the radio. And the challenge fascinated me. So by the time I got to high school, I already knew what I wanted, and I became head of the drama technical department for high school productions, and never looked back.
So, Jim, how did you originally connect with the Peninsula Players?
I was a student at the Goodman School of Drama, part of the Goodman Theater of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Hmm.
The office got a panic phone call from the Peninsula Players saying that they had lost their set designer and could they recommend anybody. They recommended me. I got on the train and I went straight up.
Had you ever heard of the Peninsula Players before?
Mm, no, I had not.
And so you didn't really know where you were going.
That's absolutely true. I had no idea what I was getting into.
And so you took the train and I assume bus up there?
Yes, you had to change from the train to the bus in Two Rivers, I believe.
Uh
And the
huh.
bus dropped me off at the highway on corner of Highway 42 and Peninsula Players Road at the billboard. And I was escorted down to the property, and the rest is history.
I see. And do you remember what was your first impression when you walked down to the theater campus?
Well, my first impression was Mama Fisher, who took one look at me and said, "You're too young." And she was right, of course. I was only 17 years old. Oh, I fell in love immediately with the place.
Was it the location, the people, the
Well, all that, but the devotion to theater, which was uh, close to my heart.
that's been very clear to me as I've been going through the history with the Fishers and the beginning companies at the theater. Um, so you met Mama Fisher, and you met Caroline?
Well, the next stop in my introductions was Richard.
Uh-huh.
Richard had just been suffering from a bee sting, and he was laying recumbent on his couch, uh, very dramatically suffering in pain, but recovered enough to uh, talk to me about my responsibilities,
Uh-huh.
and it put the fear of God into me.
Oh, it did.
Yes, he was very imposing. He was
Indeed.
imposing and demanding.
And then how about when you met Caroline?
Oh, well, Caroline, she was the boiler room of the Peninsula Players. She made everything work in all aspects. And she was very supportive of me and often asked me to support her in her endeavors around the county in distributing handbills and promoting furniture and props. So yeah, she was wonderful to be with.
Uh-huh. So you had to rise to the challenge that Richard presented.
Yes, I did. We did 10 shows a season, which is hard to imagine,
Mm.
but we did it. And the beauty of that is that you didn't have time to think. You simply did it and did it fast and efficiently. And you learned to be a scene maker machine.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the quality part was entirely up to me to preserve the demands that were placed upon me, but it was it was grueling but wonderful.
And at that time, they were still doing shows in rep, so that Richard believed that someone who came up to Door County for a week could possibly see three shows at the Players in that time. So there was a lot of turnover and changeover.
Yes, there was. Yeah, it was a very complicated schedule, especially at the beginning of the season when there was no shows in repertory to fall back on. So that was, you really had to knock out a show in several days.
So,
Uh, Once they were in repertory toward the end of the season, it got a little more sane because there were shows uh, in repertory to be brought back to life.
I see. And how did you construct these sets so that it was possible to put them up and take them down so quickly?
Well, that's a complicated question. I must say that the quality of the productions at the Players now, 70 years later, is head and shoulders above the quality of the productions at that time. I'm not talking about acting, I'm talking about the visual quality. As I said, there was just no time to think and very little time to execute, and you did what you had to do. And that meant that scenery was largely based on flats, which were used over and over again and
Hmm.
put together easily and disassembled easily. So the changeovers weren't nearly as complex as they are now.
So you had to do quite a lot of painting.
Yes, I would paint all night while the show was going on and into the wee hours if necessary. I'd spend the day building, painting, building and painting, and at the drawing board. And then when the show was on, I'd be left alone where I could paint to my heart's content in the scene shop.
I see. At night.
Yes, at night. I had to mix my own paints. I had to order at the beginning of the season, I had to order powdered pigments for the season. And I had to predict what colors and what quantities I would need for the whole season. Then, whenever it was time to paint, I'd have to mix my own paints with powdered pigments in a glue pot.
So you had to have a good sense of color going into this.
Well, that was expected of me, yes.
Yes. Jim, early on in my time at the Players, I heard stories that back then people would take the painted flats into the bay and wash them off and dry them and repaint them. Was that at all true?
Yes, that is true. The beauty of the kind of paint that we used was that it was water soluble and
Ah,
you could wash it off. And the water in the bay became quite colorful during those episodes.
I see. Not exactly environmentally friendly, but
Right.
and I think I is it true there's a well-known picture at the Players anyway of William Munchau in front of a painting with Harvey from that show. And did you paint that?
I painted the portrait of Harvey, yes, the rabbit,
Yes, you
with
did.
with Bill Munchau, yes.
Oh,
Yes, I did.
and I there's an article. I don't even know if you know this. In 1952, in the Green Bay Press Gazette, that you were the youngest professional scenic artist in the country.
I wonder if they did their research.
So, Jim, in your painting and building scenery, did you have any help with any of that?
Yes, we had apprentices who would be assigned to help, and a staff carpenter, and Ted Bird, who was the technical director, and who I would describe as the only technical director who could be characterized as elegant.
I,
Everything he did with elegance.
oh, I think he would love to hear that. The theater at that time was essentially a barn with the side cut out of it, right?
Right? Yes, not much more than that.
So there wasn't much in the way of you couldn't really fly scenery.
Yes, we could fly scenery, but not completely out.
Hmm.
So we had to trip drops, which means fold them in half or in thirds on their way out so that they would disappear in the limited fly space.
Wow, that sounds complicated.
Yes, and all the rigging, of course, was hemp rigging with a pin rail and sandbags for counterweights. Uh, so that was it became a relic, a historic relic after a certain amount of time because not many theaters still had that.
Yes, and that lasted for quite a long time. It was still like that when I got there.
Hmm.
Um, and at that time, there was, of course, the canopy over the audience.
Ah, yes, one of my many duties, aside from designing and painting scenery, was to, when it rains, uh, push push the water out of the bellies of the canvas, walk in amongst the audience, poke the belly, and let the water splash off the rear end of the canopy.
Ted Bird had mentioned that when he was back there running the shows, that's where the water poured off.
Well, there was a makeshift control booth built at the back of the theater, which was just beyond the edge of this canvas canopy. So when all the water spilled off the canopy, of course, it hit like a tsunami against the control booth.
Oh, dear. So, theater in the woods is always an adventure.
Yes.
And Audie had mentioned that sometimes the front of the audience would flood if it rained very hard. Do you remember that at all?
Well, that water had to go somewhere. After it went off the back of the canopy, it hit the gravel of the elevated rear seats of the seating area and washed down that slope down to the footlights through the feet of everybody in the audience.
Oh my God.
Uh,
Did you ever have to bail that out?
no, it took care of itself.
It did. Okay,
Just kept on flowing through the audience.
I see. A real adventure. So, and where did you live while you were there?
I lived above the scene shop. There were two rooms above the scene shop, and one of them was for Dan Scott, the actor, for most of the time, and the other was my compartment. So I had my drawing board up there and did all my paperwork up there.
Oh, that's nice that you had your own room. You didn't have to share.
Right.
Oh,
But that
yes.
I needed that because I was up late at night doing draftings.
Uh-huh. And actually, we have still been using those rooms as housing.
Yeah, they're rather special
Yes,
in many ways.
though we don't really build in the scene shop anymore because it was not very big, really.
It was not, only big enough to store the flats and give me a place to paint scenery at night.
And did you do any work with any of the gardens? I assume Richard did most of those.
Oh, Richard did, and he had Edie. I can't remember her last name, who
Uh,
was in charge of the gardens as well. But
Edith
no,
Dunn.
I'm not a. Yeah, right, exactly. Yes, I'm not a gardener, nor would I have had time. I did have other duties besides the ones I've already mentioned. I operated the front curtain of the for the plays. Uh, I don't simply because I was free to do that. I'd open the curtain and then go back and paint scenery until it was time to close the curtain for the first act, and then I just go back and forth from painting to curtain duties for the plays. I
And
also, because I'm a classic music lover, I also was put in charge of selecting music, pre-show music for every production, and I would play it on the phonograph prior to the curtain going up.
I
And
see.
I should mention that the pre-show music for the opening of the season was always the Zampa Overture by Harold, and I plead with you, Greg, to reinstitute that tradition at some point soon.
Okay. So when you were out painting, you had to really keep your ear open for when you had to go back to lower or raise the curtain.
Well, the stage manager would come and fetch
Yeah.
me.
Oh, I see. And the stage manager was backstage?
Yes,
I
somebody was backstage, yeah. And that was Jim McKenzie, who later went on to own the Peninsula Players.
Yes. What's your memory of Jim at that time?
Oh, well, he was very an efficient stage manager. That's my memory.
Oh, good. And did you have I know that Leo Lucker was there for quite a long time. He was the leading
Yeah.
man.
All of the actors uh, lived in a parallel universe from the one I lived in, because they were either in rehearsal or in performance all the time, and I had very little contact with that activity because I had my own activities.
Hmm.
Uh, I've mentioned a number of responsibilities, but there's still more.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
once a week, once a week, I'd get in the car with Carolyn, and we'd go all over the county distributing handbills. And while she would chat up the owner of a store, I would be pasting handbills in the window of the storefront and putting supplies of handbills for customers to take. And I got to know everybody in the county because Carolyn knew everybody in the county.
I see.
I even met Jens Jensen at the clearing uh, just before he died,
Yes.
thanks to Carolyn.
Yeah, the clearing started the same year that the players did in 1935.
Right.
And in these trips, were you involved in finding furniture and props?
Yes, absolutely. Carolyn knew where to go. One of the best sources was from the composer's cabin of Edward Collins, who is a well known composer and
Yes.
whose daughter was an apprentice at the Players,
Hmm.
and whose granddaughter has become a close friend of ours. And we would go to a concert that he would have in his great room of the cottage, and I'd be sitting there picking out in my mind the furniture in that room that I wanted to use in the next production.
I see.
Carolyn would expedite it.
I
Anything I
see.
needed, Carolyn could find and produce.
She was very persuasive.
Yes,
And then at some point those all had to go back.
yes.
And but you mentioned that you were because of your work and everything, you were quite separate from the acting company. But you must have crossed paths at meal times like we do now.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. So yeah, I knew all those people, but only casually.
Hmm. And I know there was a Ted told a story about Mama Fisher making sure that you didn't eat too much.
Right. Yes, she was the conscience of the company in
Really?
every respect. Oh yes, she was
You mean
quiet, but well, she was a mama. You behaved.
and did that work?
No.
So there must have been some fun stories at the time with the company, especially since you were there for a few years.
Well, most of which can't be told.
I see, which is the same today. So over the seasons that you were there, did your work evolve in any way, or
Oh yes, I learned a lot. I grew a lot. That 10 show a season schedule got revised down to maybe 6 shows instead of 10 toward the end of my tenure there,
Mhm.
so that there was more time to give more thought and uh, more devotion to the scenic aspects of the shows.
And you were still
They
going to school then too?
Yes, exactly.
So you had it was quite a practical learning experience for you there.
Absolutely invaluable. Yes.
I mean, what would you say if you had to say what the biggest thing that you took away from working at the Players then?
Oh, that's a complicated question. So many things. Just the very thing that I told you, it struck me the first moment I arrived. Devotion to the theater,
Hmm.
in a nutshell, is the answer to that question.
There was in working on the history with Audie, we have found that there was um, indeed a great concern to do quality work as much as possible and bring artistry to Door County.
Well, let me give you one little anecdote. In my fourth season, Richard Fisher was not in residence. He'd gone off to Hollywood, I believe, to work with the Jack Benny show.
Hmm.
Uh, but he came back periodically on quick trips to check up on things. And I had a show on stage that was uh, kind of a Tudor Gothic show, largely painted in browns. And he was outraged when he saw that on stage and told me, "Don't ever again paint a show in brown." He just thought that was an unhappy color and that it was not appropriate.
I see. Did you change it at the time or just leave it?
I had no choice. I had to leave it.
I see. I see. So he was quite critical.
But he also was uh, he was a genius. He was very well educated in cultures and of all kinds, and he taught me a lot about appreciation uh, for culture.
I
So
see.
yeah, he was a good mentor for me.
Uh-huh. And you must have known Papa Fisher then at that time.
I did. Papa Fisher was always smoking a cigar, which meant that he always had empty cigar boxes, hundreds of them, on shelves in his little shack filled with pieces of hardware, nuts and bolts and screws and washers. And when anything needed to be fixed, none of these boxes had labels on them. but he knew where to reach immediately for which box, which had exactly the right bolt in it to fix whatever needed to be fixed at that moment. But another thing about him, though, was that he was addicted to vinegar, and he kept a bottle of vinegar hidden behind those cigar boxes. And he would sneak into the shed and take a swig from the vinegar bottle. And then Mama would see the perspiration on his bald head and say, "You've been drinking vinegar again, haven't you?"
That's amazing. I've never heard that. Were there, while you were there, were there any shows that you worked on that were your favorites? Or I know when I'm working on a show and people ask me that, I say, well, my favorite show is the one I'm doing now. But were there
That's
any
my stock answer too.
were there any that were special challenges?
Well, the last show of the season was an original satirical musical review,
Hmm.
and that was always a lot of fun, just because the show itself was a lot of fun, but the variety of scenery that went with it was fun to produce. So yeah, those were my favorites.
Oh, they were, yeah, and quickly. And then you were there, I believe, till 53 was at that time your last season there, I think.
Right.
And then what happened?
I went into the army.
I
Now,
see.
one of the actors during that time was Bob Thompson,
Hmm.
who everybody knows. Uh, and he became sort of my surrogate father. So while Mama Fisher was my surrogate mother, Bob Thompson became my surrogate father. And he always looked after me in my social life. And it turns out that I had to appear before the draft board in Milwaukee to plead my case to be a conscientious objector,
Ah,
which was a pretty tricky thing to do at that time.
sure.
Uh, but it had to be done. And so Bob Thompson piled me in the car early in the morning. We drove down to Milwaukee, which was no mean trick because there were no interstates at that time.
Yeah.
I made my appearance. I got in the car and drove back up and in time for him to be in the show that evening. So I will always be grateful to Bob for escorting me back and forth on that that episode.
I see. And so then, so that you didn't have to go into the military.
No, I did. I
Oh,
volunteered to go in
oh, you did.
as what they called 1AO, which means 1A means that you're very eligible to be drafted, and the O stands for objector, which means that you automatically get assigned to the medical corps, which is what happened to me.
And where did you serve?
At various ugly camps throughout the United States.
I see. I think that was around the time of the Korean War, right?
Yes, it
Or
was Korean War.
yeah,
The
yeah.
Korean conflict, yes.
And how long were you in the service then?
2 years, the minimum. And I ended up being a neuropsychiatric technician at Madigan Army Hospital in Seattle, Washington, in Tacoma. And uh, I've got a lot of stories to tell about electroshock therapy. If you remember, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I was one of those orderlies. But that's a whole other story, Greg, for another interview.
Indeed, and I know in your history with the players because we're looking at the early 50s when you were there and that you have done a whole bunch of design work at the players in the since the 90s. So and that's a whole nother conversation. Are there
Yes.
any experiences in those early years when you started at the players that you'd like to recount or memories that still stick with you?
Let me mention a couple of other of my duties.
Oh, okay.
Appear on stage, and I detested that, and it happened twice.
Yes.
The very first play that was done uh, when I arrived was Born Yesterday, and I was told that I had to play the part of the bellhop, and I had a line. The line was "Yes, sir," and that's it. But I had such a hard time facing the audience and saying that line because I just had no desire whatsoever to be on stage. So that I vowed never to be on stage again. But it didn't work out. I was cast again
Yes.
as a camera operator in a play called Once in a Lifetime. When
Uh-huh.
I had no lines, all I had to do was pretend that I was operating a camera. But even that was painful for me. So that was the end of my acting career at the Peninsula Players and in this lifetime.
I see. Well,
And one more duty, one more duty to relate, and that is the duty of being babysitter, because Carolyn and Rodian's children needed attention during the day. So along with building and painting scenery, I kept them under my wing. I enjoyed them so much, and they enjoyed being with me. And there are many stories to tell about that, but that's for another interview as well.
did they ever help you in your work or,
No, they were too young.
you know? And
Eloise could have helped.
so how did you keep them occupied?
Well, we would play games after dinner before it was time for people to disperse and go on stage or for me to go and paint. Um, Audie had mentioned the production of Carolyn starred in the title role, and her lover was Armand. You recall her talking about that. Well, the real Armand was a poodle dog owned by the Fishers named Armand. And Armand would join our festivities with the children uh, after dinner every evening when the bats would come out. And we would dance on the lake shore where the bats were swirling around catching insects. And Armand, the poodle dog, was jumping in the air trying to catch the bats. And the children were chasing after Armand the dog. And I was chasing after the children. So this was a ritual that we went through every evening.
I see. And Ted Bird mentioned that the bonfire was always going to.
Yeah, that's a tradition that we still have, yes. Let me mention about Rodian, who had the world's longest commute. And he thought nothing of traveling from Egypt to Fish Creek at the drop of a hat and uh, coming just to be with his family for a few days and then getting back on the plane and returning to Egypt. So it was a lot of fun to have him arrive. And there is a photograph that shows Rodian supervising me or watching me paint a backdrop.
Uh-huh.
What that doesn't tell us is that what I'm painting on in the sky of that backdrop is a tiny little TWA airplane.
I see.
On every show, whenever I had a chance to paint a backdrop, I always put a little airplane in it for Rodian.
I see. Was there anything else that you wanted to add or say about then?
Well, there's a couple of names that I haven't heard mentioned much,
Yes.
who should be paid attention to, and one is Ray Taylor. Raymond Taylor was the composer of the music for the musical reviews, the last show of every season. And so he was a musical genius, and he was the guiding, he with Richard Fisher were the guiding lights behind those productions.
Mm-hmm.
And the other person I want to mention is Milt Collins. I don't know if that name has ever come up.
No.
He was, I believe, dietitian to the stars. And he would come from Hollywood and spend a few weeks every summer with the players during the time I was there. sometimes as a bit part actor on stage, sometimes as just a general handyman around the company doing filling in for whatever needed to be done. And then he would give lectures in the lodge to the acting company, to the entire company, on his theories of dietary practices, which were way ahead of his time and probably had a lot of scientific backing in them. But it had to do with the separation of the foods you eat and the ones you don't mix in the same meal. And it, it was always fun to have Milt around.
I see. No, his name has not come up before, and Mama Fisher approved of that.
Uh, oh yes, yeah. That his contact was with Carolyn, who had been a starlet and probably met him during those days in
Yes,
Hollywood.
there was a big connection between Fish Creek and Hollywood, as well as New York, because of their contacts.
My wife has just handed me a note to remind me that along with painting a TWA airplane in the sky for Rodian, I also would always paint a daisy into the set somehow for my wife, Carol, who loves the daisy flower and always looks for it in
I
my
s-
scenery.
oh, I didn't
No
know
one else
that.
would notice either of these things, but they're there.
Oh, all right. I will have to look at your designs from now on more
Yes,
closely.
it'll be there somewhere.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to hear about that period of time when you were starting out there, and my gosh, what a great experience for you in your early formative design years.
It was invaluable.
Well, again, thank you, and I hope that we can chat again about. There's so many other things we can chat about, I know. So I hope we can do this again.
We'll do it. Good.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.